Welcome to St. Jerome's and welcome to the St. Jerome Center. We are a little overwhelmed by your warm welcome or your presence here. Thank you for being patient as we arranged a few more chairs and rearranged the stage. At the very last minute, Dr. McFaig informed me that she doesn't like a big old podium in front of her. She likes to freewheel and speak, and so I had to make some alternate arrangements. I'm going to begin to talk about the Dease lecture endowed by the Loreto Sisters, the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and then I will introduce Dr. McFaig to you all. The theme of the 2004-2005 St. Jerome Center lectures is Christians Without Borders, and how appropriate that theme is today for the annual Teresa Dease Lecture. The Dease Lecture was endowed by the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or the Loreto Sisters, and it honors Mother Mary Teresa Dease, the superior of the first convent of the IBVM in North America, and she was the Superior General until her death in 1889. The Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary was founded by an Englishwoman, Mary Ward, in 1609. Her dream was to create a community of women religious without borders. That is, women dedicated to the religious life who lived outside the comfortable borders of the cloister and the convent. Modeled after the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, these women were to be free to respond in faith to the urgent needs of their time. Now, no one transgresses such an important border without paying a penalty. And Mary Ward was imprisoned by the Inquisition and initially condemned by the Church. But her charism would not be contained so easily, and it now lives on in the members of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary throughout the world. So we are pleased that a number of the Loreto Sisters could be with us here for this celebration of their spirit and their work, especially Sisters Doreen Kirby and Carmen Diston. Thank you for your generosity in establishing this lecture. It is also appropriate that tonight's Teresa Dease lecture is known for crossing a few borders of her own. Dr. Sally McFaig is widely admired for her compelling work on how our image of God shapes and sometimes limits our faith lives. She has challenged us to rethink our traditional ideas of God, to venture past the boundaries set by our churches and our universities. Many of you have read her books during your studies. They include Models of God, Theology for a Nuclear Age, The Body of God, An Ecological Theology, and Life Abundant, Rethinking Theology and Ecology for a Planet in Peril. You cannot read Dr. McFaig's book without having the feeling that your own boundaries have been stretched, overcome, or sometimes even exploded. Dr. McFaig is the Distinguished Theologian in Residence at the Vancouver School of Theology and former Carpenter Professor of Theology at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, where she also served as head of the Divinity School. She holds an honorary Doctor of Letters from Smith College. The 2004-2005 Dease Lecture is also part of a broader event called Challenge for Change. Challenge for Change is an ecumenical educational effort, which is my great privilege to participate in. Challenge for Change has its main lecture tonight, and then tomorrow morning again at St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Kitchener, Ontario. Dr. McFaig has very generously agreed not only to be our lecturer tonight for the Dease Lecture, but also to give the keynote address tomorrow at the Challenge for Change event, and for this we thank you. But tonight's lecture is called God's Household, Christianity, Economics, and Planetary Living. Sally McFaig challenges one of the most fundamental and unacknowledged boundaries in Christian thinking, the idea that God is first, last, and only concerned with the saving of human beings. In this model of God, creation, that is everything that's not us, is defined as profane, empty of meaning and grace. And yet she reminds us that as God completed the first 5 days of creation before humans were created, at the end of each day God said, it was good. Only on the sixth day were humans added to the formula. Dr. McFague challenged us to rethink the boundaries between humans, those with souls, and other creatures, allegedly those without. Moreover, she also asks if human beings are, as free market capitalism suggests, greedy individuals who deserve all that we can get. She asks, are we not also members of a vast, complex community of creatures, all of whom need the basics for living? The question really is, where exactly are our borders? Where are the boundaries of the self? Are we really no bigger than the boundary of our own skins? Are our interests no greater than our net worth? To help us think about these questions, join me in welcoming to St. Jerome's Dr. Sally McFague.
Sorry, had to get that all settled away. Actually, welcome. Sorry there wasn't enough seats for people. I've also recently crossed another border. I became a Canadian citizen in June. In fact, I have a wonderful story to tell you about that. I don't know whether I should do this or not, but it's so tempting. And that is, at the ceremony for becoming a citizen, I was chosen to accompany Judge George Springate, who was the judge, to lead the rest of the folks in the national anthem. And you have to realize, you have to know a little bit about my background to know what a highlight this was for me, because from the time that I've been a young child, I was never allowed to sing because I don't have a voice. I can't sing. And in fact, when I went to college, which was Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, there were signs around saying, everybody sings at Smith. And so I thought, great. And I went to try out for the freshman choir. And they said no. So I didn't sing at Smith until I did get my revenge, because I was president of the student council, and I had 5 minutes at the end of my term with the whole student body in front of me to give a little speech, but I decided to sing instead, and I made them listen to my rendition of Ah, Sweet Mystery of Life. I have done that occasionally since in different circumstances, embarrassing my 15-year-old daughter once so badly she slid under the table at this horrible thing that her mother was doing. Anyway, this is the lead-up to this great event in which George Springate, the judge, came around and was asking all of us where we were from, and I said I was from Boston, Massachusetts. And so then it was time to do the anthem. And suddenly I saw his hand going like this in my direction, and I thought, oh, goodness, they're taking me out at the last moment. I'm not good enough to be a Canadian. And then he said, finally, Massachusetts, come up here. So I went up there, and he said, I want you to help lead the national anthem. Well, folks, I mean, what a country. I mean, my old country wouldn't even let me sing. My new country, the first thing that they asked was for me to lead the national anthem. So this country not only appreciates talent, it appreciates those who don't even have talent, but want to come here. So I'm so pleased to be here tonight with you all. I don't suppose we have to ask the question any longer, does religion matter? After 4 years of the present United States government, where religion has been a major player in politics, we all know how much religion matters. Why does religion matter? Well, religions help to form people's worldviews. That is, who we think we are in the scheme of things and what we can and should do. In other words, religions help to form the most basic assumptions of who we are in the scheme of things. As an example, the Bush government has a worldview in which the individual is king. Our side is always right. The other side is evil, and to top it off, our side is fulfilling God's plan. Religion matters. So what we're going to look at tonight, you have a sheet that's been passed out to you, is two worldviews. One I've called the neoclassical economic worldview, and the other one the ecological worldview. Now, I'm not in any sense identifying the neoclassical worldview with the Bush administration, but the assumptions of this view do allow for such things as the emergence of something like the Bush administration. And before I will start, I just have to say, I'm from, as you could tell, I'm from Boston, so the Red Sox, we all know what the Red Sox did the other night. And I guess feeling as strongly as I do about this whole thing, being deeply embarrassed to be an American at this time of what might happen in a week from now, I would trade that win this week for a Bush defeat next Tuesday. Okay. God's household, Christianity, economics, and planetary living. None of the world's major religions has as its maxim, "Blessed are the greedy." This is amazing, given the many differences among religions on doctrines and practice. It's remarkable to find such widespread agreement at the level of economics. Often, however, religion is not considered to be about economics. In fact, many in most societies do not want religion to intrude into economics at all. It is preferable, they say, for religion to attend to religious matters and leave economics to the economists. But most religions know better. They know that economics is about human well-being, about who eats and who does not eat, who has clothes and shelter and who does not, who has the basics for a decent life and who does not. In other words, economics is about life and death, as well as the quality of life. So economics is not just about money, but about sharing scarce resources among all who need them. Economics is a justice issue, so why would religions not be concerned with it? It's no coincidence that the Greek word for house, which is oikos, is the source of our words for economics, ecology, and ecumenical. All three of those words come from the same source. They belong together. In other words, in order for the whole household of the planet to flourish, the Earth's resources must be distributed justly among its inhabitants. The human ones and the other ones, the earth ones. And it must be done on a sustainable basis. The three basic economic rules for all to thrive in this household are quite simple. They're sort of things that you'd pin up on your fridge if you had a bunch of people living in your house. Take only your share, clean up after yourself, and keep the house in good repair for those to come. They sound very simple, but spelled out, they are very deep. So these rules should be pinned up on the planet's fridge, right, for all members to memorize and follow. They are necessities, not suggestions, that constitute the basic economic laws for long-term planetary well-being. Now, this economic paradigm is certainly not the dominant one in the global society, nor is the one that most Christians seem to be embracing. To be sure, Christians do not openly support blessed are the greedy. Nonetheless, that is the way that most of us live. And why is this the case? Quite simply because we are members of a society, now a worldwide one, that accepts almost without question an economic theory that supports insatiable greed on the part of individuals. This theory lies behind present-day market capitalism, and since the death of communism and the decline of socialism, it is accepted by most folks as a description of the way things are and must be. Market capitalism, in other words, is seen as the truth. Now, although market capitalism is a description of the way things are in our society, it is not a description of the way things must be or should be. Market capitalism is a type of economics that allocates scarce resources on the basis of individuals successfully competing for them, without regard to the needs of the planet's inhabitants, nor with any eye to sustainability. In other words, it's an economic model that's making a case for how scarce resources might be allocated. It is not a description of how they must be. Now, this realization that economics is not a hard science, that is, it's an ideology with an assumed anthropology and a goal for the planet, which we could summarize with greed and growth. This is the first step, I think, in seeing things otherwise. Ecological economics, to look at the list that you have there, that is, economics for the well-being of the whole household of planet Earth and all its creatures, this is also a model. And it also has an anthropological and planetary ideology. It claims that human beings, while greedy to be sure, are even more needy. That is, we depend on the health of all the other parts of the planet for our very existence. Clean water, breathable air, arable land, plants, and so forth. Ecological economics claims that market capitalism denies one huge fact, and that is, unless the limited resources of the planet are justly distributed among all the myriad life forms so that they can flourish, there can be no sustainable future even for the greediest of us. We cannot live without these others who are the source of our existence. We can live only a few minutes without air, a few days without water, a few weeks without food. Of all the creatures, we are the neediest. So, am I suggesting that ecological economics is Christian economics? No. It is, however, an emerging economic model that is being increasingly set forth and supported by a wide range of NGOs and protest movements. Its motto is, "A different world is possible." A different world is possible. And its basic tenets are fair labor laws and environmental health. Lynn White, a theologian writing back in 1967, lay the blame for environmental deterioration at the feet of religion, specifically Christianity. Remember, subdue and dominate? If Christianity was capable of doing such immense damage, then surely the restoration of nature must lie in part also with Christianity. I believe it does, but also with other world religions, as well as with education, government, economics, and science. The environmental crisis is a planetary agenda involving all people, all areas of expertise, all religions. This is the case because the environmental crisis is not a problem that any specialization can solve. Rather, it is about how we, that is, all of us human beings and all other creatures, can live justly and sustainably on our planet. That is what the environmental crisis is. How all of us together, human beings and other creatures, can live justly and sustainably on our planet. It's about the house rules that you pin up on the fridge that allow you to live so. These house rules include attitudes as well as technologies, behaviors as well as science. They are what the oikos, the house that we all share, demands that we think and do so that there will be enough for everyone. The house rules are concerned with the management of the resources of planet Earth so that all may thrive indefinitely. Now, how does religion, and specifically Christianity, fit into this picture? It fits where all religions do, that is, at the point of the worldview underlying the house rules. It fits at the level of the deeply held and often largely unconscious assumptions about who we are in the scheme of things and how we should act. While anthropology is not the only concern of religions, it's a central one, and for the purposes of the ecological crisis, it may be the one that counts the most. Now, I want to suggest that Christianity, at least since the Protestant Reformation, and especially since the Enlightenment, has, through its individualistic view of human life, implicitly and sometimes explicitly supported the neoclassical economic paradigm. That is, the current consumer culture, which is devastating the planet and widening the gap between the rich and the poor. If you turn over your sheet, you will see a champagne glass. Most of you have seen this before. Probably everybody in this room fits into the top fifth, where all the goodies are. Mm-hmm. And this shows where the rest of the population is, with some of the people at the bottom living on $1 or $2 a day. So, and this is an old champagne glass. It comes from it's about 5 or 6 years old, so it's even worse than it was then. Okay, now, as an alternative to this view, we would suggest that Christianity and other religions should support an ecological economic model, one in which our well-being is seen as interrelated and interdependent with the well-being of all other living things and the earth processes. In other words, religions, and especially Christianity in Western culture because of its enormous influence, have a central role in forming who we think we are and have the right to do. It is our claim that the individualistic anthropology is deep within our consumer-oriented culture and is presently supported not only by religion, but also by government, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to quote from the American document, as well as contemporary economics, that is, its insatiable greed. That is, you have religion, government, and economics basically working with the same anthropology of who we are in the scheme of things and what we should do, which is a very individualistic one. You have contemporary religion in the form of born-again religion, where the individual is saved for another life, or New Age religion, which again focuses on the individual, on his or her comfort and the therapy for the individual. You have this combined with a government policy, certainly in the United States, which is radically individualistic, and a contemporary economics, which is based on the insatiable greed of individuals. So what you have is what has been called a sacred canopy, which is spread over the whole culture. That is, you have the three big pillars of institutions, of religion, government, and economics, all saying pretty much the same thing. Hey, folks, it's okay to act this way. It validates the behavior of people so that they can say, hey, I'm not doing anything differently than other people are doing. I'm just living the way everybody else is living. It's difficult to believe that science and technology alone can solve an ecological crisis that is supported at this deep level by this triumvirate of economics, government, and religion, because it legitimates human beings continuing to feel, think, and act in ways that are basically contrary to the just distribution of the world's resources and the sustainability of the planet itself. So let us look at these two worldviews a little bit. The neoclassical economic one and the ecological economic view. They are dramatically different, suggesting different anthropologies and different house rules. The first model sees human beings on the planet as a corporation or a syndicate, a collection of individuals drawn together to benefit its members by the best use of natural resources. The second model sees the planet more like an organism or a community that survives and prospers through the interdependence of all of its parts, human and non-human. The first model, interestingly, rests on assumptions from the 18th century about individuals and their rights and responsibilities, and of the world as a machine or a collection of individual parts that are externally related to one another, not internally. That is, what happens in one part does not affect what happens in another part. As in a machine, you can take out a part and put in another part. The second model is quite different. It rests on assumptions from postmodern science about who we human beings are. We are not just individuals with rights and responsibilities, although we are that. I mean, the wonderful thing about the Enlightenment was it gave us those rights, and we're certainly not turning our nose down at them. But what it lacked was, what the 18th century view lacked was a sense of the interrelationship and interdependence of all of us that has come about with postmodern science. That we are also the conscious and radically dependent part of the planet. The world is a community or an organism from this view, which is internally related in all its parts. And that's an enormous difference between an external and an internal relationship. So that what happens in one part of the organ, like in one part of your body, is going to affect what happens in another part. Now, both of these are models. They're interpretations of the world and our place in it. Neither is a description. This point must be underscored because the first model, that is from the 18th century, seems natural. Indeed, it seems inevitable and true to most middle-class Westerners, while the second model, which actually is from the science of our own time, seems novel, perhaps even utopian or fanciful, talking about interrelations and interdependence. I mean, these are nice things if you can get them, you know. But, I mean, basically, we're individuals who have to take care of ourselves, right? Okay. In fact, both of these are models, and they come from different historical periods. Both are world pictures that are built on these assumptions, and each vies for our agreement and our loyalty. By neoclassical economics, we mean market capitalism as conceived by Adam Smith in the 18th century, and more particularly the version of it practiced by the major economies of our time. The key feature of market capitalism is the way allocation of scarce resources occurs. That is, as the result of individual market transactions, each of which is guided by self-interest. At the base of neoclassical economics is an anthropology. This anthropology says that human beings are individuals motivated by self-interest. The value by which scarce resources are allocated, then, is the fulfillment of the self-interest of human beings. The assumption is that everyone will act to maximize their own interest, and by doing so, all will eventually benefit, the so-called invisible hand of classical economic theory. So neoclassical economics has one value, and that is the monetary fulfillment of individuals provided they compete successfully for the resources. But what about other values? Two key ones, if we have the economics of the entire planet in mind, are the just distribution of the Earth's resources and the ability of the planet to sustain our use of these resources. However, these matters, that is, distributive justice to the world's inhabitants and the optimal scale of the human economy within the planet's economy, these are considered externalities by neoclassical economics. They don't figure into what you pay when you buy a product, for instance. They're not part of the loop. These are externalities that companies get slapped with fines for environmental damage after it's done. Right. Okay, so they're not part of the system. In other words, the issues of who benefits from an economic system, in other words, distributive justice, or whether the planet can bear the system's burden, sustainability, these are not part of neoclassical economics. Now, when we turn to the alternative ecological economic paradigm, we see a different set of values. Are we basically greedy or needy? Well, we're probably both. But our answers may veer in one direction or another, and if so, we find ourselves embracing either an individualistic or a community model of life. Ecological economics claims that we cannot survive, even to be greedy, unless we acknowledge our profound dependence on one another and the earth. human need is more basic than human greed. We are relational beings from the moment of our conception to our last breath. The well-being of the individual is inextricably connected to the well-being of the whole. Now, these two interpretations of who we are and where we fit in the world are also mirror opposites of each other on the three critical issues that we've been looking at. That is, the allocation of scarce resources, distributive justice, and sustainability. Neoclassical economics begins with the unconstrained allocation of resources to competing individuals, on the assumption that if all people operate from this base, then issues of fair distribution and sustainability will eventually work themselves out. Ecological economics begins with the viability of the whole community on the assumption that only as it thrives now and in the future will its various members, including human beings, thrive as well. In other words, ecological economics begins with the issues of sustainability and distributive justice, not with the allocation of resources among competing individuals. Before all else, the community must be able to survive its sustainability, which it can do only if all members have the use of resources. That is, if all the members are healthy, if they're all doing their own thing. It's the only way that the whole can survive, if the parts are fed and watered. Then, within these parameters, the allocation of scarce resources among competing users can take place. That is, once some parameters are set up in terms of sustainability and distributive justice. So ecological economics does not pretend to be value-free. Its preference is evident. That is, its value is the well-being and sustainability of our household planet Earth. It recognizes the oikos base of ecology, economics, and ecumenicity. In other words, economics is the management of the community's physical necessities for the benefit of all. Ecological economics is a human enterprise that seeks to maximize the optimal functioning of the planet's gifts and services for all users. So ecological economics then is first of all a vision of how human beings ought to live on planet Earth in light of the perceived reality of where and how we actually do live. We live in, with, and from the Earth. The Earth sustains us. We must sustain the Earth. An economic model that does not have as its first priority the sustainability of the planet cannot be good for human beings. The neoclassical market model does not have such a priority. Hence, it is not good for us, even if we like it, and we do like it. We are addicted to our consumer lifestyle, and we are in denial that it is bad for us and our planet. The model we need is very different. To recall, the ecological model claims that housemates must abide by three main rules. Take only your share, clean up after yourselves, and keep the house in good repair for future occupants. We don't own this house. We don't even rent it. It's loaned to us free for our lifetime, with the proviso that we obey the above rules so it can continue to feed, shelter, nurture, and delight others. These rules are not laws that we can circumvent or disobey. They are the very conditions of our existence, and they are intrinsic to our happiness. Now, if we were to follow these rules, we would be living within a different vision of the good life, the abundant life, that is current in our consumer culture and that is presently destroying the planet. Now, given these two worldviews, the neoclassical and the ecological economic ones, which should Christianity and other religions support? Presently, they are supporting the neoclassical economic paradigm to the degree that they do not speak against it, because it is so prevalent. All you have to do is say nothing, and you are supporting it. Unless they speak publicly against it and side with the ecological view. Now, does it matter what the religions do? Well, as I said, starting off with an indication of what the last 4 years have been in the United States under an administration where religion has been fuel for the policies of the government, religion certainly does matter. If one accepts the assumptions that worldviews matter, that is, that we are in very profound ways influenced by our unconscious assumptions of who we are and what we think we are allowed to do. Now, there's no direct connection between believing and acting. I mean, it would be nice if there were. I mean, the Greeks said, to know the good is to do the good, and Paul said, oh dear me, I know the good, but I don't do it. So there isn't a direct connection between thinking and doing. But there is an implicit, deeper, and perhaps even more insidious connection, and that is the worldview that persuades us that it is natural, that it is inevitable. This becomes the secret partner of our decisions and our actions. Most people in our consumer culture, which includes all of us, we're not bad people. We're just doing what everybody else is doing on the basis of very deep assumptions that are now embodied in our culture's main institutions. Moreover, a persuasive case can be made that there is an intrinsic connection between the ecological economic model and Christianity. Distributive justice and sustainability as goals for planetary living are, I think, pale reflections, but reflections nonetheless, of what Jesus meant by the kingdom of God. Let's look for a moment at a vivid portrait of Jesus by the New Testament scholar John Dominic Crossan. He writes, he says, "The open table and radical egalitarianism of Jesus' kingdom of God are more terrifying than anything we have ever imagined. And even if we can never accept it, we should not explain it away as something else." Radical egalitarianism and open table. For Jesus, says Crossan, the kingdom of God was epitomized by everyone being invited to the table. The kingdom is known by its radical equality at the level of bodily needs, the most basic needs. Crossan names the parable of the feast as central to understanding what Jesus means by the kingdom of God. This, as you recall, is a shocking story, trespassing society's boundaries of class, gender, status, and ethnicity, since its end result is to go out in the streets and invite everybody to the feast. There are several versions of this, but in each one, a prominent person invites other, presumably worthy people to a banquet. All of them refuse for one reason or another. The frustrated host then tells his servant to go out into the streets of the city and bring whoever they find to dinner. The poor, the maimed, the blind, the lame, the good and the bad. The list varies in the different versions. The shocking implication is that anyone is invited. As Crossan remarks, if beggars come to your door, you might give them some food or even invite them into the kitchen for a meal, but you don't ask them to join the family in the dining room or invite them back on Saturday night for supper with your friends. But that's exactly what goes on in this story. The kingdom of God, according to the portrait of Jesus, to this portrait of Jesus, is, quote, more terrifying than anything that we have imagined because it demolishes all our carefully constructed boundaries between the worthy and the unworthy, and it does so at the most physical, bodily level of who eats and who does not. For first century Jews, the key boundary was purity laws. One did not eat with the poor, with women, the diseased, or the unrighteous. For us, the critical barrier is economic laws. One is not called to sustainable and just sharing of resources with the poor, the disadvantaged, or worst of all, the lazy. To do otherwise in both cultures is improper. In fact, it's not expected and it's shocking. And yet, in both cases, the issue is the most basic bodily one. Who is invited to share the food? In other words, who lives and who dies? In both cases, the answer is the same. Everyone, regardless of status, by any criteria, is invited. This vision of God's will for the world does not specifically mention just sustainable planetary living, but it surely is more in line with that worldview than it is with the satisfaction of individual consumer desires. This vision is based on need, not greed. And the body is the locus. That is, how we treat needy bodies gives a clue to how a society is organized. It suggests that correct table manners are a sign of a just society, of the kingdom of God. If one accepts this interpretation, then the table becomes not primarily or only the priestly consecrated bread and wine of communion celebrating Jesus' death for the sins of the world, but rather the egalitarian meals of bread and fishes that one finds throughout Jesus' ministry. At these events, all are invited to share in the food, whether it be meager or sumptuous. Were such an understanding of the Eucharist to infiltrate Christian churches today, it would be mind-changing. In fact, it might even be world-changing. At the very least, it is terrifying. Is it also absurd, foolish, utopian? Perhaps, but as I've suggested, there appears to be a solid link, a degree of continuity between this reconstruction of society, that is, the kingdom of God, and what we have described as the ecological economic worldview. This worldview is closer to that terrifying picture than is the neoclassical economic model. Perhaps it is at least in the right direction, and if so, how can we not try to move that way? If this is the case, then for middle-class North American Christians, it may well be that sin is refusing to acknowledge the link between the kingdom and the ecological economic worldview, explaining it away because of the consequences for our privileged lifestyle. Sustainability and the just distribution of resources are concerned with human and planetary well-being for all. This is, we suggest, the responsible interpretation of the parable of the feast for 21st century well-off North Americans. It demands that we look at the systemic structures separating the haves and the have-nots in our time, that is, those invited to the table and those excluded. And it demands that we name these structures for what they are: evil. They are the collective forms of our sin. They are the institutions, laws, and international bodies of market capitalism, often aided by the silence of the churches, that allow some to get richer and most to become poorer. Our sin is one of commission, but perhaps more damningly of omission. That is, our greed camouflaged by indifference and denial, and even by our good works of charity for the uninvited. In order to dislodge the neoclassical economic worldview and Christianity's complicity with it, there are many things needed, and I'm just going to mention a few. The first thing that I'll mention is becoming conscious that neoclassical economics is a model and not a description of how to allocate scarce resources. There are other ways to live, other ways to divide things up, other goals for human beings and the planet. Economics is always necessary, but not necessarily neoclassical economics. Ecological economics is an alternative. Since the death of communism and the retreat of socialism, religious worldviews are one of the few sources left to critique the hegemony of market capitalism. This is a very important point, I think. And as long as we had communism and socialism around, at least market capitalism could not pass itself off as the only economic system, as a description. It could be seen more easily as a model. But since the decline of communism and the decline in many ways of socialism as well, it appears as if market capitalism has won out and is the truth. It's a description of the way things are. So that's why I think that religions have to take on part of this enormous task of helping people to question the basic assumptions of who they are, who we are in the scheme of things, and what we should be doing, which is not being done in most parts of our culture. Religions are, one of their main tasks is to help people form these basic worldviews, and it's even more central that we do it now. So, without the presence of alternative visions, a model becomes an ideology. This is always the case. I mean, any model will become an ideology if it has no alternatives. And market capitalism has in our time this wonderful line from Erich Heller, a German philosopher who wrote, he said, be careful how you interpret the world. It is like that. Be careful how you interpret the world. It is like that. Our interpretations become our reality. The second step, in order to dislodge the neoclassical economic worldview and Christianity's complicity with it, is that we suggest some visions of the good life that are not so consumer-dominated, visions that are just and sustainable. The good life is not necessarily the consumer life. Rather, it could include the basic necessities for all, universal medical care and education, opportunities for creativity and meaningful work, time for family and friends, green spaces in cities, and wilderness for other creatures. One can imagine different scenarios, which would be a good life. It's interesting that Sigmund Freud said, I think he was right, after the basic necessities of life, what really matters for people in terms of happiness is two things, good work and good love. And, it's pretty much on the market. I mean, it's much better than your third Lexus or Cadillac or whatever. A study that was done, a lot of studies have been done on consumer happiness in the last 20 years or so, and it was discovered that Americans, people from the United States, were happiest back in 1957. They haven't been as happy since, even though they have a lot more money than they had in 1957. But the money, after a certain level, does not make you happier. We need to ask what really makes people happy, and which of these visions are just to the world's inhabitants and sustainable for the future. A third step is for well-off Christians as well as others to publicly advocate the ecological model. The model, as I say, that now this is very broadly understood among NGOs, protest movements. This is not simply something that a few economists have been picking up, as a more just and sustainable one for our planet, to publicly advocate it. While it is not the kingdom of God, Christians have the obligation to work for systems that are at least faint approximations of it rather than clear opponents of it. Specifically, this means becoming informed about the global injustices of market economies, joining with other NGOs to change the policies and practices of so-called free trade that result in impoverishment and unsustainability, and accepting the consequences for one's own lifestyle that sharing Earth's resources more justly and sustainably will entail. There will be pain. There's no way around it for folks like us. A fourth step is to rethink what such a different context, that is, the ecological, economic one, would mean for the basic doctrines of Christianity. Our understanding of God and the world, Christ and salvation, human life, and discipleship. Now, this is a huge task, which we're not going to try to do tonight. I hasten to calm your fears. But I want to say just a few comments to end my remarks tonight. A few brief comments about the issue of God and the world, because this is at the heart of who we think we are and what we should do. Since our interpretive context, the ecological economic model, is about the just and sustainable allocation of resources among all planetary users, the framework then for speaking of God and the world becomes worldly well-being. Or to phrase it in terms of a gloss on the theologian Irenaeus, the glory of God is every creature fully alive. The glory of God is every creature. He said man, but we're not going to do that. It's every creature fully alive. I think Irenaeus would have said every creature if he had been with us today. Dietrich Bonhoeffer called it worldly Christianity. That is, what the kind of Christianity we're talking about, the sort of re-understanding of the relation of God and the world. He said, God is neither a metaphysical abstraction, nor is God the answer to gaps in our knowledge. God is neither in the sky nor on the fringes, but right in the center of the village, in the midst of life, its joys and its pains. An ecological economic model means an earthly God, an incarnate God, an immanental God. The ecological model means a shift not from God to the world, but from a distant God, related externally to the world, to an embodied God who is the source of the world's life and its fulfillment. The neoclassical economic model goes very nicely with an understanding of God who, like a human being, is an individual. In fact, God is the super individual who controls the world through laws of nature, much as a good mechanic makes a well-designed machine operate efficiently. This God is at the beginning in creation and intervenes from time to time to influence personal and public history, but is otherwise absent from the world. You don't want God fussing around in your public policies and your economics. Keep God out of the picture. The ecological model, on the contrary, claims that God is radically present in the world, as close as the breath, the joy, and the suffering of every creature. The two views of God and the world, then, are very different. In the one, God's power is evident in God's distant control of the world, and in the other, God's glory is manifest in God's total self-giving to the world. Well, in closing, let us recall that a just and sustainable planet is the great work of the 21st century, as Thomas Berry said, to which all religions, indeed all areas of human endeavor, are called. Never before have we had to think of everyone and everything altogether. We now know that if we are to survive and our planet flourish, we will do so as a whole or not at all. This common task is summed up very nicely in this following sentence, which I will read to you twice as in the closing. It says, he said, this is Robert Constanza. Probably the most challenging task facing humanity today is the creation of a shared vision of a sustainable and desirable society. One that can provide permanent prosperity within the biophysical constraints of the real world in a way that is fair and equitable to all of humanity, to other species, and to future generations. I'll read this again. Probably the most challenging task facing humanity today is the creation of a shared vision of a sustainable and desirable society, one that can provide permanent prosperity within the biophysical constraints of the real world in a way that is fair and equitable to all of humanity, to other species, and to future generations. Thank you. I guess there's some time for some conversation.
Yes, Dr. McFaig has generously agreed to take some questions. is Ivan out there with the microphone. Ivan, if you can make your way in. If you have a question, raise your hand. Ivan person will bring you the microphone, and you can ask your question.
First of all, just thank you very much for your presentation. It's been fabulous. And I wanted a quick comment on the use of the parable. I'm hoping that the openness of the college campus will allow me to use a term that's a little bit more colorful. But your use of the parable was fantastic and very rich, especially as it offers up a chance to the feast holder in one rendition is kind of a label whore as he throws some.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Someone is that the feast thrower is kind of a label whore as he throws out one person for not being dressed properly in one rendition. But I don't want to waste the time with that. The parable, there's an international cry, as we hear, of course, for freedom. And we also hear the contradictory, thing for justice. And as one former citizen, and I'm here trying to get in the same manner. Is there a possibility of what we learned as children of those, or what is the relationship to the Pledge of Allegiance, to the ending of the Pledge of Allegiance that puts freedom and justice together? Is it, are they inconsistent, as Berlin suggests, are they continuum, or how does that ideal of freedom and justice together work into this?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I'm sure, the best person to answer it, but I'll give it a try. Can you hear me? Is this working? Yeah, okay. I don't find them dualistic. I mean, I don't find them that they are contraries. It depends on what one means by freedom, especially. And I think in a good deal of Western culture, particularly, again, in American culture, where this is probably the strongest, freedom has often taken a libertarian understanding, so that freedom means free to do whatever you want. It is the individual, it's the cowboy riding off by himself, to have his freedom. It's freedom to have the biggest car you can have, to drive as fast as you want. There's another notion of freedom, which is freedom from want, freedom from oppression, freedom from dying as a child when you're not even a year old. I mean, freedom to live, freedom to have the necessities of existence. To me, this is a more important understanding of freedom, and one that goes very well with justice. I don't see freedom as libertarianism, as the freedom to do whatever you want. I think that connotes a very individualistic understanding of who we human beings are. I mean, if we really are postmodern people and take contemporary science as our guide, we are going to begin to look at ourselves differently. And that is as a community, not in some kind of nice way, well, communities are nice, but this is the most objective way to look at ourselves now, given what postmodern science is telling us from studies in ecological science and in biology. We have evolved altogether over the last 15 billion years from one big bang, and we are related in one form or another to oak leaves and slugs and deer and certainly very, very closely to all other human beings who one could say is our immediate family. Those are our immediate family. And then we have all our other relatives as well. So it's a change in, that's why I say the assumptions of what one thinks, who one thinks one is. What is a human being? Is it an individual that has the freedom to do whatever you want? You can have a gun in the back of your pickup. Hey, I got to have my gun. I mean, that's a kind of freedom. That is one understanding of it, but I think it is a perversion.
Thank you very much for the excellent lecture, first of all. Just 2 points. I think that all the modern talk, including the Charter of Rights, everybody seems, well, I shouldn't say everybody, but the emphasis is on rights. In the old days, used to be rights with responsibilities. I think that's a shift in emphasis in modern times when you listen to all the protesters all around the globe. Secondly, very quickly you passed over the Protestant Reformation and the individualism.
Right.
Calvinist opinion that God blesses the rich. If they're rich, that's the sign of God's favor. And if we look a little more into the medieval theology, including Thomas Aquinas, it would be closer, much closer, to your ecological, to the Christian.
Yes.
It's ecological economics.
Right.
Thomas Aquinas, if we read, for example, a short passage on labor, what is the real purpose of labor? It's very, very different from individualistic neoclassical economics.
Right. Well, it's a very good comment, very true. I mean, medieval culture, although we may object to some of the dualistic hierarchical relationships in medieval culture, there was plenty of relationship. I mean, that is, you were not an individual that stood on your own. You were within a society, within a church, within a government, within a family, probably within a trade, and there was a place for all other animals. This is why you could symbolize the whole, the symbols between heaven and earth were very complex because the whole thing was related. Now, we may not like that kind of hierarchical kind of relationship, but it was radically relational. What happened in the 18th century is the gift of being an individual, which, I mean, we embrace that. I mean, who wants to have to be a cobbler because your father was a cobbler? Or who wants to have to be a housewife just because you're a woman? I mean, what has happened in the last 200 years is a wonderful gift, and I don't think in any way we should undercut it or sell it short. People who don't have individual rights of the sort that we're talking about feel it very deeply, and this has been true in totalitarian countries, people who do not have the freedom to speak and so forth. So I don't want any way to undercut that. But what did come in was a movement towards the individual in so many different ways. George Hendry, who is a theologian, a Presbyterian theologian, said there were three different contexts in which to do theology: the cosmological, the political, and the psychological. And the cosmological includes all of creation. The political includes, as in Calvin and in others, the whole body politic, the city, for instance. Liberation theologies also would fit into this. But it's this psychological category over here that has become dominant in our culture, so that religion, theology, Christianity is pretty well interpreted in terms of God in the individual. I mean, so often the world is sort of left out. What God really cares about is human beings, and especially certain human beings. And maybe, hopefully, me. So, I mean, there is this movement. It isn't, all three of these are necessary, the cosmological, the political, and the psychological, for a full, rich theology. So that the Redeemer is also the Creator, is also the giver of freedom from oppression, and is also our spiritual guide and our deepest comfort and friend. These are all important. But if you start with the psychological, which is what has happened in our culture since gradually, the last several hundred years since the Protestant Reformation and the turn to the individual, you see it everywhere, has been this slide into seeing religion as pretty much focused on individuals. And this other stuff has been forgotten. The political has been taken up, as I say, by the liberation theologians, and the cosmological, ecological theology is simply a return to the creation theology, that the Redeemer is also the Creator. So, what we have seen is, in the last couple of hundred years, is a kind of narrowing, as if nothing mattered, only the individual, rather than the individual within the polis and within the cosmos. Does that help to give it a little? So it isn't that it's bad. I mean, we wouldn't want to give up. One of the great things about ecological thinking, which I discovered, was that when we try to think of how the one and the many go together, this is a big question, it's been so since Plato. That is, how do you combine the one and the many? Well, the Americans, in their stereotype, do it with the melting pot. You put everybody in the pot and you stir them, and they come out the same. The Canadians have made a progress on that, and you have the mosaic, where you have everybody in different little separate spots here. But what ecological unity says is that, and this is amazing, that the unity, the whole, is nothing but all the individuals doing their own thing. So that it's radical individuality, on the one hand, couldn't be more so. I mean, we have 1,000 different kinds of mushrooms. Who needs them? But we got them, you know. And that is radical individuality combined with the whole being nothing but the parts, so that you have radical unity and you have radical individuality. These are not opposites. You are not giving up your individuality in order to be part of an ecosystem. You are playing your part in it. And in fact, what happens with an old-growth forest when it is cut down and reseeded with a monoculture is that you lose that diversity and the thing becomes unhealthy. So individuality is a wonderful thing. It's individualism, which is a bad thing, which does not realize that it has to be interdependent and interrelated with all these other individuals. I love this. I mean, it's a whole different understanding. It's much better than either the American or the Canadian view, I think, of the one and the many. So I pass that along. So, yeah.
Yes, you mentioned that you had an addiction to consumerism. I'm wondering if you could give us some suggestions, especially for churches, as to how we can get away from that, some practical ideas for individuals and for the churches as a whole.
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful question. I won't try to answer it in any kind of depth, but John Cobb, a name some of you probably have heard of, and others have suggested that consumerism is the world's most popular and growing religion. That it's more than just consumerism, it's more than just what we do. We are now adherents of this. We are members of this religion. And the malls are the cathedrals of this religion. And most of us, more than tithe to this religion through our credit cards. We give and give and give, don't we? We give and give and give. So, I mean, to see it that way is interesting because it takes it very seriously. It is so big now that it's a religion. It's not just that we are consumers and we consume too much, but there's a kind of giving over of our loyalties and our behavior to the market in a way that's really shocking. I mean, we are mainly now consumers. We're not citizens. We're not other things that you might call yourself, a mother or a father or a teacher. We're consumers. That's how we fit into this religion. Now, practical suggestions. Wow. I mean, there are lots. I tell you, one of the great things about the environmental movement in the churches is that there is lots of good information for any church or group that wants to start working on it on the internet and elsewhere, and there's several of us here who can help you with that if you're interested later. But it isn't that there isn't a lot of materials. There are. The problem is to help people overcome their resistance to actually making some changes. There's lots of material. Yeah. Lots of suggestions. Yes?
Over here.
I was just wondering how you think that we're going to actually overcome the monopolies of wealth that's in Western culture. Like, how are we going to get over that part of our ideology and move on to a new view such as ecological?
I didn't hear the first part of your question.
How are people who have the wealth in Western cultures, how are we going to convince or change their ideologies so that they understand that there's a new way that it needs to be done, or at least a different model that it needs to follow?
Well, as I said, it's a planetary agenda. It is not any one thing that can be done. It's not a specialization that you can call in the experts and say, okay, we got this problem, all these people that have too much money and these other people that don't have enough. How are we going to solve this problem? So it's a planetary agenda, and one has to find one's niche. There are lots of different things that need to be done. That is, we need to start educating people differently. We need to make cars differently. We need to grow our food differently. We need to bring up our children differently. We need to do medicine differently. There isn't any field that is not touched by this. And I came, just my own little story, about 30 years ago, I became conscious through a lecture, actually, that I heard, like you guys sitting here, and I heard a lecture, and it was by Gordon Kaufman, who's a theologian at Harvard, and he was saying that the situation in the world, and it was then the nuclear situation, is so drastic that we can't continue doing theology the way we've been doing it. We've got to reconstruct, we've got to deconstruct and reconstruct our doctrines of God in the world, Christ and salvation, discipleship, and so forth, in order to live rightly and appropriately in this different situation that we're in. And I took that to heart, and I thought, well, I'm a theologian, so I'm going to take this bite of it and try and work this. But whatever you're doing in your life, whatever you have a passion for, whatever you think you will stick with and become good at, that is going to make a change, do it. I mean, this is at the personal level. There are many different, as I say, this is a planetary agenda. It needs to be done at the personal, professional, and public levels, all of these levels. So it's what you do in your personal life, what you do in your job life, and how you vote. It's multidimensional. There isn't any one thing that'll do it. My little bit, as I say, is to work on this worldview thing because I'm a theologian, and I think that basic assumptions of who people think they are, these are not, as I say, you're not going to go out and change overnight, but unless one sees another alternative, unless one sees another possibility, it's very, very difficult to leave what you've got. I mean, we just don't do that. Nobody steps out into empty space. You've got to, and this is why utopian thinking, alternatives, a different world is possible, that wonderful phrase from the NGOs. Yeah, a different world is possible. Believe it.
Your answer kind of feeds into my next question, because I'm a technologist.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you what role you thought technology has to play in building
Huge.
a sustainable environment.
Absolutely.
And seeing that technology, by and large, has come out of the classical economical neoclassical model, do you think there's a potential of blending these two models in creating that sustainable environment, or are they at the root fundamentally opposed?
Absolutely not. I mean, I don't think I'm the last thing I am is a scientist. I'm not an economist either. I had to read up hard to learn what I did. I'm a theologian, but it was interesting. A few years ago, there was a journal whose name slips my mind, put out by a bunch of scientists who said that technology is going to solve the ecological crisis, and as this was about 5 or 10 years ago. This was fairly widespread, that technology will take care of it. And people liked that idea because it meant they didn't have to change their lifestyle, but technology would do it. That has proven not to be the case. As I suggested, because this is not the sort of thing that is simply a matter of that any field can deal with. Every field is going to be involved in it. And the critical role that religions are going to have to play in this. But technology is going to be absolutely central. That is the right kind of technology. Everybody knows that, if the car industry had the will and if we put the screws on the government to make it happen, we could have different kind of cars, radically different kind of cars. The technology is already there for them. And put some real big money, the kind of money that goes into oil and mine development, and we could have a different transit system than what we have. That's the incredible sadness of it. Technology is not the evil. The evil is in us and our unwillingness to use technology in a way that's going to make the world better. So I think it's a total misconception to put technology over against religion or this ecological model over against technology and say that technology is somehow wedded to capitalism. No, science can put itself at the service of what it wishes, I would think.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to talk. I think the idea of ecological economics is extremely important. And in thinking you have to take it further, that's not sufficient. And religions have a role to play there. There are some contemporaries in our time who who've made efforts. I think one would be John Paul I, who wanted to emphasize a north-south orientation rather than east-west. In other words, he was concerned about justice that the rich countries of the north had to share with the less rich countries in the south. Unfortunately, he was nipped in the bud. There's all sorts of stories about that, which suggests the possibility that there is some risk in putting forth these points of view, particularly if you're in a very powerful position. There's also the whole counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s, which I think in many ways is very much in tune with much of what you're saying. One of the leading lights there was the economist Fritz Schumacher, who wrote the book Small is Beautiful, also a book called Good Work, I believe. He spoke to the idea of economics as a way of the spirit. He spoke at a conference I attended in Scotland on the world crisis and wholeness. But there's even maybe John Lennon and the Beatles, who in many ways were saying things somewhat in the direction that you talked about. But I think all of us today we have to take your ideas to heart, and we have to influence our churches and our governments to move in a direction that is so necessary that the planet is going to continue to survive.
Now, what you've said is interesting because all the movements that you've mentioned are countercultural in some sense. And religion is, when it's doing its job, is also countercultural. I mean, it has become established. And one of the problems with mainline churches, both in the Protestant denominations and in Catholicism, is when they become mainline, established. That is, they become part and parcel of the culture. Then it's very difficult for them to see themselves as fringe movements, as countercultural, as the thorn in the flesh, doing the uncomfortable thing of being prophetic. Hey, you're going to lose members if you're prophetic. And this is what's happened to a lot of the mainline Protestant churches. They are losing members, which does not make them very brave. Don't rock the boat. So, yeah, there is going to be some risk involved. I find that I've been teaching this material now for quite a while, and when students start getting into it and realize if you read The State of the World, which comes out every year, put out by the World Watch Institute, and you read the statistics of what's happening to our planet in all sorts of different ways, it's economics, medicine, population, land, whatever, you're just overwhelmed with despair. And you think, this is too awful. I mean, we can't do anything about it. The whole system is against us. And we're going to, why not just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die? Why bother? But then you think, well, I have to wake up in the morning and look at myself in the mirror. And I have to keep doing that day after day. Am I going to be able to do that? I mean, unless some way or other you find your niche in which you are willing to take some risks and get involved. And a lot of people are now. I mean, this is not just a Christian movement by any means. This is a worldwide movement. In fact, in many respects, you could say that it is the NGOs that have been stronger in some respects than most of the mainline Christian churches. So, I mean, this is the agenda for our century. I don't think there's any doubt about it, whether we're up to it. The last century had the Second World War as sort of their big thing. Well, our big thing is trying to hold on to this planet in some kind of just and sustainable way.
We have time for one last...
Coming back to your ideas about consumerism, it seems to me I heard somewhere that if you really want to do something individually about that, turn off your television sets with all the commercials and leave them off.
It's a very good suggestion.
Perhaps one last one there, Ivan. This gentleman here. That was so brief.
Yeah.
Maybe this is going to be a downer question, but I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing the distinction between just allocation of resources and allocation of scarce resources. And I guess this is coming from, it's an old criticism that the new classical economics have, but that's the question of if you have to choose a very simple example, if you have a sick baby or a sick grandmother and you have enough resources to save one, what is it just to save?
Yeah.
Now, neoclassical economics starts from having an answer to that question. The person who's saved is the one who can afford the medicine. But I didn't get any sense in your talk of what the ecological economics response is, and I'm wondering if you have any insight into that.
Yeah. I imagine that this would be decided differently in different contexts. I can't imagine taking a, what should we say, abstract theoretical position on such a case, the one that you mentioned, between a sick grandmother and a sick child, and say, well, the one that has the money or has the right to get well, I can't imagine doing that. So what would be a generalized statement that one could make between these two individuals? I can't imagine what it would be. I really can't. I think it would be contextual, that you would, if you had to make a decision, this is in triage situations. One of the sad things in some triage arrangements is that for instance, in some forms of process theology, you may have heard about this, because the whole notion of satisfaction is the criterion, that is, the higher you are in the scale of things, the greater your level of satisfaction can be. Therefore, you are more valuable. So I have heard it said, well, what about a triage situation in which you have a rowboat and you only have room for one more person, and one is a violin virtuoso and the other is just a very ordinary person. Which one would you save? Well, on that criterion, you would save the violin virtuoso because this is the person with greater potential and has a larger degree of satisfaction. I find I can't imagine any general theoretical criterion to make a case that you are making between two individuals. I'm sorry, I don't know how to answer the question.
Thank you very much.